Today I'm joined by Alex Gutentag. She is a public school teacher in California and a former union representative. And she's been in my Twitter feed lately with some of the most well-framed positions on lockdown and COVID and this dystopian hellscape that we're all navigating. So welcome, Alex. I'm really happy to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Excellent. So I think one thing that I've already mentioned, you are in California, which has been the kind of the subject of a lot of chats on the internet and off, and it seems to be a bit of almost religious center now with COVID. It's one of the most kind of restrictive states in the U.S. And like, what's your vibe being on the ground? I mean, I can maybe deduce from your tweets, but maybe you tell me in person how is it to be in California at the moment?
Well, it's interesting. I think that California probably represents some of the worst kinds of excesses of lockdown politics. And we have been, in a lot of ways, the last to start some of the reopening phases. I think we are dead last in terms of schools being open. Our students have the least amount of opportunities for in-person learning in the country. And I'm, in a city, so a lot of the major cities, I think, are very invested in COVID restrictions and, like you said, some of the religious rituals around it. So it's a bit dystopian given the fact that we also have huge levels of inequality here, really high homelessness. California actually has, I think, a quarter of the entire country's homeless population. So there is a lot of, on the one hand, expanding inequality, huge rising levels of low paid contract work, gig work, and on the other hand, for affluent professionals, a ton of attachment to kind of mainstream news, COVID narratives, and all of the things that go with that, like masking, social distancing, etc. And every time there is a push to reopen, coming from some of more small businesses in the state, there's always a pushback from a lot of liberal cities saying things like, this is going to kill everyone, this is genocidal, etc. So it's pretty extreme here.
Yeah, I can imagine that. It's is there any political will now pushing back against it, or is it just, same
Yeah,
old, same old?
Yeah, there is, because there is a recall. There was a recall petition for Newsom, and they got enough signatures. So I'm constantly now getting emails from Newsom saying like we have to stop the recall, and saying everybody behind the recall is like a avid Trump supporter, an anti-vaxxer, anti-masker. These are the things they say to like get people to be against the recall. Um, so there is a lot of pushback, and especially from small business owners and also certain places that are more red, like Orange County. There's been a lot of pushback. Um, but some of it has definitely come because of some of the missteps of Newsom, in terms of just showing clear hypocrisy, because he famously went to this fancy restaurant in Napa called the French Laundry, where dinners are
Hmm.
up to $850 per person. And he also had his kids going to in-person private school while the public schools were closed. So he has brought some of it on himself for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this has definitely been a big headline on the internet, and people were really skewering him over it. But I feel like it's it's cold comfort to the people who will have their businesses destroyed by this. And it is really interesting, like what the mimetic effect of these policies are, because I'm in Eastern Europe, I'm in Romania, and um, you know I feel like if there was some independence in how the stuff is to be handled, I don't think we would have had these extreme lockdowns and everything. But we've had this happen in kind of a centralized location. It was tied to, you know, very high status people who were saying, okay, you need to wear the mask, you need to lock down indefinitely, and all this type of stuff. And it seems to have just caught on everywhere in the world because we have this here now, and it's we have intermittent lockdowns here as well, like businesses opening, closing, on the whim of the government. It's I don't know how much of this is European policy, if it would have worked in Europe the same way, but it does feel like it's kind of trickling down from these high status memes that we see in America, because it's quite shocking to people who come here that everything's downstream from America. It's about maybe 4 or 5 years later, people still like the show Friends here, but it's it's still pretty like intensely American.
Yeah.
um, yeah, so you wrote a really, really interesting piece in the Bellows, which was still pinned on your profile, and it's one of the best summaries of what's going on in terms of lockdowns and COVID, and gig work and everything that you mentioned in there. So I want to ask you about kind of what do you see the causes of this, because it does kind of put me in a bit of a conspiratorial mood to see that this has been the largest wealth transfer that I've ever witnessed in my life, and it's you can't talk your way around it. This is impoverishing the middle and working class, and it's moving money to people like Amazon, who are not people, they're shareholders.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm curious what you see, like, as I don't know, the causality is hard to pin down, but it seems to be quite a concerted effort.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the numbers right now are something like, I think billionaires made something like $3.7 trillion, and workers lost $3.9 trillion. So there is a very clear correspondence between who lost money and who gained money through lockdowns. I think the question of how it happened and why, there's certain parts of it that we may never know because we're not you don't have total access to every single decision that's made and why it's made, but there are certain things that you can say are definitely a clear economic agenda. Like in the United States, we had the CARES Act, and in the CARES, the first stimulus, and in that there was 100 and something, like $135 billion in tax cuts for millionaires. That's not a conspiracy. That was just the legislation that our representatives passed. So I think that we live in a class society, and there's a huge profit motive for the people at the top. And in a lot of ways, they kind of live in somewhat of a different world than the vast majority of other people. So I think that the incentive for tech companies and the incentive for every arm of finance to take a crisis and make money off of it is always going to be there, whether it's an explicit plan or not.
Yeah. So in this case, things were already kind of moving towards digitization, but it did really speed up the plans for almost every tech corporation that has it in its business is to serve your needs through your screen rather than through your community. That's what, to me, it feels like it accelerated every process that was kind of already pointing in that direction. Because if stuff can be solved for your community, you don't really need Amazon. You don't need the screens to serve you. So in that way, it was like pretty much an accelerationist process.
Yeah.
Yeah,
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 exactly. And I mean, I think with a lot of tech services, we think of it as some sort of adding something to us or giving something to us, but a lot of certain services have taken things away and then replaced them. So if we're thinking about gig economy, um, for something like Uber, it's taking away access to like car ownership, taking away access to public transportation, and replacing it with a service in which people are treated as totally disposable. So these things are going to become increasingly profitable, as also there's a lot of incidents where there's public money. So, for example, what happened in education, we have now a ton of public money being transferred to tech companies to provide educational tech because everything happened online. And then as schools open up, we also are seeing a lot of public money being transferred to private pharmaceuticals or testing companies to make things safe for reopening. So these are all transfers also from the public sector to the private sector.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how this whole gig economy show seems to be played as, okay, we're empowering people, we're giving you the tools to, become an entrepreneur. It's always spun in a very positive way, and this extends from things like Uber, which is driving a car around, to stuff like OnlyFans, or even more advanced forms of sex work that you can do online, or at least intermediate through online. And it's very interesting to me that a lot of corporations seem to be just running cover for this stuff. Like, it's not, they're not ever outlining the fact that this might have a downside. And I feel like the main vibe and culture is, don't speak up against this, because you're attacking the people doing it. But typically when people do offer a critique of this, or they're critiquing the corporations, which don't they don't protect the workers. They don't, they're not obligated to give you anything. It's like they're just throwing bread into the circus, and
Yeah.
expecting you to thank them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a weird, it's a very, very strange relationship we're expected to have with these corporations now. And in a way, I mean, I come from a more, I don't know, I wouldn't say libertarian, but kind of more free market bent. And now I've kind of understood that, okay, there is a certain scale at which these companies, the powers they accrue are not on par with the obligations that they have, or obligations that can be imposed upon them in any way by anyone, especially multinational corporations. And you see this here in Romania as well. Like, they come in, they set the terms, everyone wants them here, obviously, because they're job creators, they pay taxes, for as much as they do. They improve the economy, they bring all sorts of things in here. But at the same time, it leads to what I think you called it in your piece, like the theft of a meaningful life. Like, could you expand that? Like, in what ways is this form of living, robbing us of what's meaningful?
Well, specifically, I guess with what happened with lockdowns, there were huge increases in mental health issues, and especially I think for adolescents in the U.S., there was a 30% increase in their mental health related ER visits. Tons of examples of also in the UK, Canada, of calls to suicide hotlines, lockdown being mentioned as a reason for suicidal ideation. In the US, we had something like 1 in 4 young adults contemplating, like thinking of suicide. Very dark statistics. And I think the levels of depression and anxiety have really shown that you cannot just take public services and also communities away from people and expect that to be sustainable in the long term. And I think a lot of the time with lockdown, um, where people who will defend it will still think of it as like a temporary thing. But it wasn't 2 weeks, it was indefinite. And so if you're a teenager, if you're a young person, and you're being told that you're indefinitely not going to see your friends, you don't necessarily have a future, you can't do any of the things that many other generations got to experience, There's no economic opportunities. That's just going to really grind you down, no matter how much you're told that it's all going to be fine or it's all part of the plan. So I think that part of why uh, things are maybe opening up now is just because it's not sustainable to subject people to a life that is completely on a screen and separate from other people. Eventually, our animal need to be around other people, I think, will win out. But there's definitely a very strong corporate push to make sure we're atomized and constantly using digital services. And that's not a conspiracy theory. That's just how they make money, and that's just how the data economy, uses people as products.
Yeah, and in a way, it's inevitable, like you say, because this is the business model. You really do need to be on platform. That's how they make their money through
Yeah,
every second you're on there, and yeah, they're strongly incentivized to create algorithms that convince you that the next 10 minutes on Twitter are really precious to you,
yeah,
even if you'd like to do something else. But it's quite
yeah,
surprising how good they are. Like I keep trying to customize my experience by getting all these blockers and things like that, but
yeah.
they don't work. It doesn't really work.
Yeah, and it's really frightening to think of for adults, screens and phones and social media is super, super addictive. So for kids who are growing up on it, who don't know anything else, it's just going to be kind of a disaster because there'll be all these little like dopamine addicts who don't know anything else, who've been wired to be constantly on screens and have no other reference point. Um, so I don't know what they're going to be like when they all grow up.
Yeah, I mean, you've kind of been in contact with kids. I don't know what ages do you teach?
I teach middle school age, so that's like
Okay,
11. Yeah,
yeah. So you've seen kids who've already kind of been smushed into the screens early on, and do you see any kind of changes between generations? I don't know how long you've been doing this, but is there kind of a tech tell that kids have been immersed in this stuff a little bit too much, or
Well, I feel like I've been teaching for about 8 years, and just the prevalence of phones and their need to always look at it, I think, has increased. But it's not just kids. I feel like I've seen that same thing to happen to adults too. I think with kids, until they were taken out of school for like 12 months and put on a screen, it wouldn't have necessarily been my primary concern. But one thing that I think is very important to think about for them now is that, especially for younger kids, so not necessarily the kids I interact with most, they are still developing concepts of what is another person, and if a lot of that concept just comes through a screen, it's going to be really hard for them to differentiate another person in real life versus someone they see on the screen, like for example on a television show, or a celebrity. And I think that um, it's important to keep in mind that it's not just incidental that kids are having this experience, but I think they're in fact being targeted in a certain way. Because if they can start using certain products or have certain modes of thinking from an early age, that will be really profitable. And also, for schools, I think kids are also being targeted with education technology, because if they have to grow up and have a job where their boss is not a person but is an app, it's very important for them to train at an early age for their teacher is not a person but their teacher is an app. Um, so
yeah.
the labor model that you're expecting kids to go into is kind of reflected by the education that you're giving them.
Yeah, I keep hearing that from people that I know who have kids as well, because they say, "Oh, I'd really love to take away the phone, or I'd really love to kind of give my child at least a screens light experience." But there's always that concern that they're not, keeping up with the tech that is going to help
Yeah.
them in the labor market. I mean, do you see any option? I mean, I don't know if you know about this stuff, but is there, have you seen anyone do this right, where there's kind of a balance of how much you interact with this stuff and how much you maybe, I don't know, put the kid in a bunker or something? It's pretty hard. It sounds almost impossible to do. But are people doing this?
I don't know. I mean, I feel it seems like an impossible situation. Uh,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So
Because kids want to be like other kids. That's an.
yeah, and they also want to be like their parents and the adults in their life. So if they see all the adults in their life on screens and stuff, that's also something they're going to emulate. So it's really an impossible situation, I think, for parents.
Yeah, I was actually I met up with a friend of mine today, and she was there with her baby, and yeah, baby's super cute, and she had all sorts of toys. But one of the toys was a kind of a mock iPhone, and I was like, this is a bit strange. What does she want that for? I guess it's an imitative toy, because it's like, she either wants your iPhone or she gets the mock iPhone with, the
Right.
dead
Yeah.
screen, which is less stimulation. But I
Yeah, that
was
makes
like,
sense.
that's a pretty strange toy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't ask about it, but now that we're talking about this, it occurred to me like, yeah, that's a very newfangled thing. You wouldn't have that in the past. That's
Yeah.
not a wooden horse for sure. But yeah, I mean, I'm curious with kids, because you said that they seem to be losing opportunities to socialize normally, and to encounter people as people rather than as 2D representations on the screen. Like, what other things do you feel like we're losing with this? Just being away from each other, like, is there, because I mean, at least for me, I know I'm losing social points by the second. I'm not very, I'm adding to my autism with every passing day. But it is, I don't know, it feels almost like a religious loss, like we're losing soul.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of people, including myself, will compare, like lockdownism or mask attachment or any of the things that have gone along with COVID to a religion. But there's parts of religion that are much more spiritual or have to do with profound existential questions that are missing from the COVID religion. So it's like only the most ritualistic parts, but none of the meaningful part of a religion. And I think that some of the things that we're losing seems like it's been a long time in the making. So probably for us versus our parents' generation versus our grandparents' generation, communities have already started to fall apart, or people have become more and more separate, more and more atomized. And this was just a huge catalyst to amplify that. And I think that there's a certain way also in which, when the culture is also so politicized and you have to take sides, or you can't have open debate, you can't like disagree with your friends, you can't disagree with your community. If you disagree with your community, you might be ostracized. That is also super isolating too. So I think that there is uh, definitely a loss of an ability to go outside, go to a local space, see people talk to people without it being intensified along certain divisive topics. And that's been really, really amplified now by the fact that you have to cover your face to go to a public space. You have to engage in whatever kind of sanitizing practices you're told are necessary to enter into certain public spaces. There's all these kind of internal stops, internal checkpoints almost, and you can't meet strangers really because you can't see them. So the
Yeah.
community
Yeah.
dissolving is basically what's happened.
Yeah, and I take your point with this kind of just being an accelerant to a trend that was already happening. Like I have the feeling that this whole thing started at the time when we didn't really need each other anymore. Like
Mm-hmm.
back in the day, however long you want to go back, people were kind of dependent on their neighbors, they depended on family. Either there was not really much of a safety net, or they were dependent on jobs or help, or extended family networks for different things. And then slowly, people started drifting more towards the market, where the market could tell you, could solve your problems for you, could solve your, sustenance problems, could solve your, I don't know, housing, shelter, everything. If you were a good market participant, you would get rewarded by,
Yeah.
getting the stuff you need. And I feel like now, because essentially the market has finally been able to plug your social gap in a way, or kind of show you shadows on the wall that kind of
Mm-hmm.
look like social
Yeah.
interaction, but just enough to keep you hooked. Yeah, curious to see, how what do you think about that position?
The position of that.
Of, yeah, just not needing each other anymore, and just kind of having our needs, or at least maybe getting stimulus to feel like we have our needs met, but rather than actually getting our needs met, which would involve a more complex relationship with people that has different layers to it, but and that might sometimes be difficult, which I think is also something we has happened to us, that you don't have to go through difficulties, like if you were like in a small village, you would have to put up with everyone because everyone was
Yeah.
essential. If you hated the baker, you had to get along with the baker because you needed the bread, and you'd make it work. But now you don't need to have social friction at all, because you have all these intermediating technologies where you can only talk to people who agree with you, and if they don't agree with you, then screw them. Next.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. That a lot of it is basically the structures that we've set up our lives to, where you don't know, you know, most of the people along the supply chain that you're a part of, or that you are the endpoint of a lot of times. So I think that that's definitely right. And I think that underneath that, though, there is a human need still. Like you said, you're not really getting the social interaction, you're getting this kind of pale imitation. And so I think that the need for, I think it's very possible for us to enter into a very long and dark period where this continues, but that ultimately there is a need for real interaction that will probably push through, and it's just a matter of time, um, and a matter of the number of people who agree on that, basically.
Yeah, and I feel like there's good signs. This I might also be just my echo chamber, but I see people being more interested in like localism, and returning, just creating almost not communes, but like more intentional communities where you meet people face to face. And you can also see this in a lot of our elites, like the people who are like
Yeah.
at the top of things. They don't really let their kids play with screens. They really have this almost like ascetic lifestyle where they, live like monks and go on like 30-day retreats in the
Yeah.
mountains and grow orthodox beards and stuff. So, yeah, I don't know. Do you think that it might trickle down from high status people if they start adopting a more like distanced lifestyle from
Um,
technology?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know. I go back and forth because sometimes when things seem really bleak, I'm like, oh my God, we're going to be in this transhumanist nightmare and we're never going to get out of the pods and it's going to get
Yeah.
really dark. And like, everything's going to be like vaccine passports and we'll never escape. And so sometimes that's how I feel. But I think since things seem to be turning a little bit towards reopening, and it doesn't seem like they're going to be able to close in the same way, at least here, because of pushback. That has made me a little more hopeful. That, like you said, the sort of soul that we've lost might kind of shine through or push through. Um, so I don't know, but the only reason that that would happen is if people keep resisting or people keep pushing back. So it could go another way. Like in a week, I could think, oh no, yeah, transhumanist future is here. There's no escape. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I also kind of flip flop on this one. I do think there might be like kind of a schism in society where you kind of have a group of elites breaking off. I mean, they've already broken off in many ways. You know, they're living
Yeah,
very separate lives to people. And then they would kind of have this, you know, monk-like existence where they realize that, oh, you know, this type of stuff is toxic. You know, you don't want to poison your body with technology, and they keep their children separate. And there's kind of like a, you know, Eloy Morlock type divide where you know you
yeah,
have this is also a dystopian future, but
yeah.
it involves, you know, the elites breaking off and learning some trad stuff. And yeah, it's quite a, I don't know, a scary reality. um uh, I like you. I don't know exactly which way this is going to go, and I keep hearing from like more libertarian people that, you know, transhumanism is not only fine, it's the future and should be embraced as much as possible. And I am not, I'm not pro transhumanism at all. It scares the shit out of me.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean,
because
I sorry, go ahead.
no, it's just because it's all about, you know, oh, they're just going to be replacing limbs and injecting you with stem cells and making you plump and great in your old age. And I'm like, oh my god, that the hubris involved in all of this stuff is absolutely nuts to me. Like, you know, the idea that, oh, you know, this special new stem cell injection is just gonna, it's just gonna, you know, reduce your crow's feet or whatever they want to do. It's like, oh, you know, the second order effects of all this type of stuff are always, you know, not always, but often horrendous. So I don't know. It's that's kind of what scares me, that people can never really predict what their domino is going to do a little bit down the line.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I definitely agree with you. I mean, I think that a lot of it seems to be, I don't know, people playing God, for lack of a better term. Um, and it will backfire. I think there's a certain level in which, if you're looking at the pandemic, you can see in some ways that some of the things that you might try to do as an intervention, especially any medicalized intervention, if you are attempting at total control, can backfire and lead to disaster. So I think that, yeah, I'm with you. I don't think that is a good thing. And I think that there is a part of technology, medicine, science that has improved quality of life tremendously for many people. Um, and then there is another side of technology, medicine, science, where we've seen a very dark history, and some very disturbing trends that are consistently papered over. We consistently act like certain things never happened. Um, and I think COVID has been just another example of that.
Yeah. And there's seems to me like a strain in this kind of hyper individualist modernity, post modernity that we're in, that really wants to deny death or not even think about it, or just say, okay, this is, you know, this is an experience that's entirely optional. Like we don't have a death culture anymore. It's because, you know,
Yeah,
as I say, always I harken back to the day. Back in the day, people would see their relatives die in front of them. You know, it wasn't
yeah,
all medicalized and
yeah,
stuff. So you'd be confronted with death just by the nature of things. But now it's all just sanitized and like it's death is impossible. No, it isn't. It happens all the time.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I mean, it's a fantasy, and for the past year, a lot of people have been playing out this fantasy, like if I can escape COVID, I'll never die, or we can have a zero death society. If you try to make a zero death society, you just end up killing a lot of people. Like what we've learned is, okay, if you try to achieve zero death, you just end up saving the rich and killing the poor. It's not going to work. So I think that um, that trend is really disturbing because I almost feel like I've just watched people almost just disfigure themselves for this fantasy, this imaginary idea that you can accept all kinds of contradictions and self-refuting ideas and then escape the most fundamental human thing, which is that people are going to die.
Yeah, it is interesting how much of like almost like a militarian cult like COVID has become. Like there are people that are so bought into this, and I understand that we do have kind of a bit of a meaning crisis. There's not really anything to orient your life around, and then this historical event happens, and it's all about people who are good and people who are bad, and people who protect other people and are virtuous, and people who are don't wear their mask the right way, or break curfew, or are not don't understand the specificities of a level 3 lockdown or whatever. It's all very it's easy to draw a line in the sand between us and them when you have this type of event, especially if you have no other lines in the sand except for like Orange Man or whatever other obsessions you might have. So I don't know. It feels like, do you think this type of religious fervor is continuing? I mean, do you feel it fading a little bit, at least in California, or is it still people are still going strong?
I mean, oh, okay. I think there's one group of people who definitely see vaccines as their ticket to freedom and have seen that as it the whole time. Who, once they get vaccinated, now feel like, okay, it's over for me, or like I see the light at the end of the tunnel. So I know a fair amount of people like that. Um, I think that there's also people who will say openly they would like to continue with masks and social distancing after vaccines. I think they're in a minority. I think the main issue is that not necessarily about those specific things continuing, but really that the narrative, I think, is not going to ever change in many people's minds that lockdown was good and it saved people, no matter how much evidence is presented to the contrary. So, one thing that I find um, like really disturbing, specifically with schools, is I've been in meetings with teachers, or I've been in situations with other not teachers, and I've presented, data about schools not being sites of high transmission, or kids not necessarily being carriers of the virus the same way adults are, etc. And in the name of science, I've seen a lot of people reject, data and comprehensive studies. So I think that culture is not going to go away, where like science in quotes has been completely undermined, and even if we leave behind certain rituals associated with COVID, I think that there will still be a definite ideology where science is whatever I want to be true. Science is whatever is, the ideology of the Democratic Party, that kind of thing. I don't think is going to go away.
Yeah, that's to me as well a super scary idea that okay, lockdown is one thing, but the level of government overreach, everyone talks about democracy and things like that. This has been the least democratic move. No one had a say in this. It
Yeah,
was by decree. It was literally military dictatorship grade stuff.
yeah,
Everyone pretends that this is this is democracy. Also, the misuse of the word democracy. Democracy means the people's choice.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean the Democratic Party and whatever, people who like the Democrats or whatever, scientists affiliated with them, have on their menu this week. And that's the abuse. And I also feel like if things like lockdown are now a tool in their toolkit, they
Right.
will whip this out every time.
Yeah.
Climate emergency, lockdown. Anything that's named an emergency will now have to, can mean that the military can put their boot on your neck, and it's fine. It's democracy.
Yeah. I mean, it's some it they know now that if people are scared, they can basically do whatever they want. So it's a great test run for a lot of worse things that could come down the line. And I think that a lot of people underestimate the precedent it sets to do stuff like just put kids out of school for 12 months. Like tell kids and families, okay, school's closing for 2 weeks, and we know a lot of you don't have internet or you don't have a computer, but it's just over for now. And then for that to continue for a whole year, you're basically undermined decades, if not centuries, of work people have done to guarantee kids a right to an education. So you I think that especially on the US left, a lot of those consequences are treated as totally trivial or totally natural to a pandemic or totally natural to a virus, and they're actually completely unprecedented and regressive, and super destructive in terms of how, like what you said, how it can come back and be used time and time again against the population.
Yeah. And in terms of like learning outcomes for kids, I guess it's abysmal this year, because obviously, people on the Democratic left will say, okay, they're doing online learning, they're getting digital skills, they are, being exposed to the same material through, same teachers. It should be fine. But I'm curious what you've seen happen to kids that, are just, they just have to do online learning. Is it, because I at least my prediction would be that they'd probably be, restless being in front of a computer and not being able to focus or ask questions in the same way as they were in class.
Yeah, I think I think it's a lot of times the case in education for affluent kids that whatever they get, they will benefit because they have a lot of support. And for kids who are lower income or kids who are from more vulnerable populations, like English language learners or kids with disabilities, they've already been let down by the education system, and now they're even more let down. So I think the outcomes for them, for kids who are already behind, where in the US they're severely behind, like 3 years behind, 4 years behind, is a very dire situation. So for kids who are already behind, it's a total catastrophe, in terms of learning outcomes. And on top of that, I would say, even if you could say the academic outcomes were okay, it's basically taken all the worst parts of school, all the parts of school that's just meaningless learning, indoctrination, and taken away all the best parts of school, which is that you get to be around other kids, you can learn from other kids, you can do hands-on activities, you have extracurriculars, stuff like that. So it's taken away the social element that could sometimes act as a bit of a barrier to the worst parts of school, as just a factory for making workers and an indoctrination machine for children. So
Yeah, that's
it's the worst part of school and none of the good part.
Yeah, I feel like that's the dynamic with a lot of things that, kind of put the onus on the individual to kind of help themselves and, pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And if I think about, platforms like, OnlyFans is always like a thing, that these are winner take all platforms. Almost
Yeah.
any platform that's like super high hyper individual is like, okay, they look at these winners, they're super empowered. Yep, sure, but the people at the bottom are just like scraping by doing like super demeaning stuff. And it really just I feel like, if you put a tech layer on top of everything, the people who are like super tech savvy and, have marketing skills and, know how to do all this stuff will rise to the top, while, you have an excuse to say, oh, we're also empowering everyone else, because everyone has access to these platforms. Everyone has access to online learning. Having access, in the bare bones minimum way is not enough for all these people.
Yeah.
So yeah, it feels like a really big fig leaf that, people are like, oh, we're just empowering people. Um, yeah, it's quite a weird, it's a weird, I don't know if it's libertarianism, but it's a strange philosophy that I see a lot of, high status people espouse nowadays. Um, in terms of stuff that's been coming up related to school, a lot of people have been pivoting to homeschooling, which is kind of has a digital component. But
Hmm.
I'm curious what you see the future of homeschooling to be like.
I'm not sure. I think if you asked me a couple years ago, I would say, "Oh no, well, first I think kids should all be in school. School's so great." But now I feel like even as a teacher, there's been a huge erosion of trust for me with schools or just with other educators. So I could definitely understand a lot more now why parents would want to homeschool. Um, I think that I don't know. I mean, I don't know how many how much it will increase homeschooling. I think it probably will. I think that if kids are doing homeschooling, I would just say it's probably really important for them to also have other activities that involve kids or community spaces, like whether that's sports or through another organization. I think that the tech aspect, I'm not super sure about. I think in public schools, you might see a huge expansion of tech just because of contracts that are done between districts and tech companies. Silicon Valley has for a really long time now been giving a lot of computers and also education platform access and to school districts in the hopes of setting up certain contracts. We had in the spring, free access to a bunch of different platforms that then we had to start paying for in the fall. So I think this is only going to continue in public schools. And I'm seeing things like they're developing technology that will read kids' eye movements to see if they're learning and stuff, so that you don't need a teacher to be watching them. Like the computer will pick up on cues of their attention, stuff like that. I hope that teachers push back on it, but I'm not really sure that's going to happen. And I think another thing we've seen in the US is a huge move to private schools because private schools have been in person. So I think it might be also a luxury thing to be at a table with other kids having a group discussion, be at a table with other kids doing a group project might become this big status thing for rich people that only their kids get that, while other kids are having their facial expressions read by AI.
That's really interesting. So private schools have been in person throughout this time, or
Yeah,
really?
not the entire time, but but a lot of the time, and I want to say they started giving, at least in California, they started giving waivers for them to open in the fall.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's I mean, I don't have any like detailed experience here in Romania, but I don't think that would have been the case here. Like you have a handful of private schools, it's true. It's not as big, but I could imagine like the uproar of having the difference between public and private. I mean, here everyone sends their kids to public school. This has just been
yeah,
a kind of communist tradition.
yeah,
Just the idea of private school. I think we had one private school when I was growing up, and it was in Bucharest, and it was the American school for the expats from the embassy. But
yeah,
that was it. It's definitely a new concept. There's something I keep hearing from people who are involved in kind of this localism movement and homeschooling, homesteading, is kind of these mixed, kind of community schools with
Mm-hmm.
mixed age children, like almost like Little House on the Prairie. And a lot of people are saying that that's it's a good system because you kind of don't have the same like feral hierarchies between kids of the same age where they have
Yeah.
to compete to be boss. So I don't know if you have any experience with this, but does this sound like an interesting spin-off of the kind of public private school education?
It's kids of all different ages all together.
Yeah, and I think there's the way they do this now is they kind of have a kind of universal teacher that oversees the different learning directions and kind of sits with different kids. There's not really that much teaching happening to everyone, but they have
Yeah.
little groups and they
Yeah.
all have projects, and the teacher's more of a coordinator, but they all come together and they do stuff together, like sports activities and artistic activities or stuff. So it's partially together, mostly apart in terms of what they actually learn.
Yeah, I don't really have any experience with anything like I don't really know anything like that here. Um, but I mean, that sounds more rooted in what would be a good educational practice, which is to have kids interacting with each other and also having individualized supports or differentiated types of activities based on their age or their needs. Versus a one size fits all model where kids don't interact at all. So, but I don't know of anything like that here.
Yeah, it's the stuff that I've heard is really like in incipient stages, and it's tied to these kind of conscious communities, and the parents are really involved. And as you can imagine, it's almost it's a pretty elite thing to do because you're kind of essentially attaching the school to a commune. But I think it's
Yeah.
an interesting experiment, especially with people who I don't know, trying to detach a little bit from the grid in some ways.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you a hypothetical question. If you were a dictator or education czar for a year or 10 years, what type of changes would you make to the current U.S. system? Because that's obviously the one you're most familiar with. But what direction would you move things into to improve outcomes for most kids? Because obviously it's not going to be there's no solution to everything, but it does seem like the status quo is quite dystopian. So what would you nudge things into?
Well, I mean, I think the class size is a huge issue in U.S. public schools. So I think hiring more staff and having I'm sorry, not bigger, smaller classes would be a big issue. But to hire more staff, you need better pay for teachers. So you need that. And then you also need better teacher training, which is a huge problem. Just lack of good programs for teachers or it's not necessarily the quality, it's just it's not comprehensive and it doesn't necessarily always prepare you super well to be a classroom teacher. Um, so I think, yeah, training, hiring, small class sizes, and equal funding for all schools, because some of our funding formulas are really messed up because they're based on property taxes and all kinds of unequal formulas. I think that the other thing I would say is, like, right now we are going to be opening, but we have hybrid models and we also have masks and social distancing in the classrooms. So as like a pressing issue, I just think that it needs to be seriously evaluated, especially for the youngest kids, whether these things are really necessary. And I mean, it's really hard to convince people to even let kids come to school one day a week right now in California. But I think a lot of teachers and even parents right now are not very well informed about the relative risks and the potential negative consequences of a lot of the safety, hygiene, theater going into opening. Um, and that would probably be another major starting point, is having an actual risk assessment around reopening, and maximizing as much as possible kids' opportunity to see each other's faces and be around each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's so much stuff that's just not measurable. It's just not legible to the state, and it's very hard to make predictions. I mean, now you've laid out a lot of the statistics around the mental health toll that it's taken, at least as much as it's measurable up to this point. But I feel like a lot of stuff, it just falls by the wayside because it's not something you can shove into a spreadsheet. Through whoever is doing impact assessment or whatever, even if they even are doing stuff like that, because a lot of this stuff seems to be just political whim, and saying, okay, no, we need the security theater. You mentioned funding. I mean, funding is a big subject, but there's also been a lot of debate in the U.S. about charter schools, voucher systems, and things like that. Like, what's your feeling about the potential for charter schools? Is that a viable model, or is it overblown?
Um, well, I think that charter schools are I get okay. I think charter schools, I can understand why families and also why teachers or educators could be attracted to charter schools. I've taught in a building that was also co-located with a charter school. So I know like those teachers and staff also very just want to teach kids, help kids. So I definitely understand why people think charter schools are beneficial. I think it's really important in the US to keep in mind the way in which investors or people who found charter schools can profit from it. And in terms of both the real estate schemes that go on and also tax breaks that happen. So I think that it's basically an avenue to privatize a lot of public education and also to direct public funding to private people or organizations. So I don't think it's a solution. And I think that there's not a lot of overall evidence that they've improved any learning outcomes for kids. So I would say overall, it's a negative trend. And they're also, I mean, there's a lot of problems with the teachers union, but it's also, the staff at charter schools are not unionized. They have crazy working hours, and they don't have a lot of protections.
Okay. So there's been quite a lot of negative attention on the teachers unions lately,
Yeah,
especially
as
with
there should
COVID,
be.
because the reaction's been. So you agree that they should have handled things maybe in a different way. Like, what's your take on the current situation of American teachers unions?
I think it's really shameful and embarrassing. I think it's really sad because in a lot of ways, the teachers union, the U.S. Teachers union, was one of the last holdouts before full privatization of our education system, and now it's just completely undermined all of its own principles, and it's basically thrown away a lot of the confidence and trust that the public had in it, because we had a wave of teacher strikes in a few different regions of the US, and we had a lot of public support. And I feel like now, if I was a parent, I wouldn't really trust the teachers union or want to support them based on their insistence that schools stay closed, despite all the evidence that the best option for public health would be to open them, and also that it wouldn't be a high risk situation for teachers. So I think that it's very unfortunate, and sometimes, I don't know, I've uh, basically heard people kind of say that it's not good to criticize the union, but I think it's really important to be honest about what's happened, because then if you're not honest about what's happened, then you're never going to have any accountability, or you're just going to keep repeating the same mistakes. And It's also important for people to know that not all teachers supported what the union has done. So I think that if it was, a year and a half ago, and you told me that I was going to be really upset with the union, I probably wouldn't have believed you because I was involved with it for a while. But now I think that it's, yeah, like I said, it's pretty shameful what's happened.
Yeah. Did you get any direct pushback from the union or anything about your comments, or did you get any blowback from being outspoken about this?
No, I think people just think I'm kind of crazy.
Yeah, I think you're
But
you're you're crazy in a good way.
I haven't gotten pushback from like the union, but maybe from just people I know, like who aren't teachers or who aren't in the union, but who really want unions and labor politics to be the answer. Um, I don't think that and my response is that I just don't think it's a pro labor position to say anything the union does is good, no matter what it's doing, because this is a very bureaucratic union. Um, California teachers, I think the average salary, I can't remember, but like a starting salary is something, 45,000 average for a first year teacher in the state. And then our union officials are making six-figure salaries, not like $1 million sometimes. So they're not, and all of our dues money goes to, not all of it, but a significant portion does go to political activities that don't necessarily improve our working conditions. um, so I don't think it's pro labor to say, oh, okay, but that's fine. um, that's still not what we want from our union.
Yeah, I feel like if you have a union that's moving things into the direction that really is to the detriment of labor in general. Like
Yeah,
essentially, it's aligned with the most capitalistic incentives in society. And if your union has the same politics as Amazon, then maybe it's not living up to its promise.
yeah, definitely.
In terms of this show, I have a show question, which is related to a subversive thinker or a writer or book that has influenced your thinking, or anything. I mean, we've had everything from video game designers to rock bands, or so anything that you think is not getting enough attention from people that might benefit from a bit of spotlight, and maybe related to teaching, could be related to anything else.
um just anything, like anything I
Living or dead, anything. I don't want this to be too broad. I don't want you to because sometimes if the question's too broad, then it's like, what even are you asking? But something that's a cultural, a producer of cultural artifacts that has been influential to you, and you think that people would do well reading him or her, or whatever. Could be a book, could be whatever you'd like.
um Okay, I would recommend this book called Fatelessness. Have you heard of it?
No,
It's
no.
okay. I don't want to butcher his name, but I'm pretty sure he was Hungarian. He won the Nobel Prize, and the book is called Fatelessness. And he was a Holocaust survivor, and the book is about his it's not autobiographical, but it's like related to his experience. And I would really recommend this book because a lot of kind of Holocaust industry books or movies really portrays it as a kind of cataclysmic aberration event that is very clear while it's happening what it is, why it is, and how it's happening. And in Fatelessness, he more kind of the main theme is people are going through the steps, they're going through the motions, and they're just taking each step one by one, not realizing where it's leading or what is happening. And I think this is very explanatory for a lot of the phenomena that we see, where we're slowly taking steps and we don't really know what we're entered until it's over or until we can reflect back on it. And especially because the perspective in the book, I think he's an adolescent. So that is also very much how adolescents operate. Whatever is happening when I'm 12 is what being a 12-year-old is like for everyone. So I'd really recommend the book. I think it's very insightful into the way that it feels to experience a major event as just a natural progression of your life. And then he has another book after that called Fiasco, which is basically more what happened after the Holocaust, and that's also worth checking out because it's kind of the continuity after. So there's like continuity of my regular life to this horrible thing, and then the continuity from this horrible thing to regular life after that.
Yeah, I haven't heard of the book, but I really like the theme because that's just how history happens. Yeah, and it happens in little moments. And there's another book also about the Second World War, not the Holocaust specifically. It's called Human Smoke by Nicholson Baker. It's kind of tracks the same theme, but the way it's built, it's in like little historical vignettes. Uh, what was leading up to the Second World War, like during the war, and kind of as it was winding down, and it's like all these like just random, almost incredible historical events where I don't know, Goebbels was going to a dinner and he made a terrible joke, and like it's really interesting because it's like it just builds the atmosphere and the randomness of all the little events that kind of created the momentum for all of these big events to happen, but they're all just random, fragments of history that, you could see how they led up to disaster, but
Yeah.
each in their own right, they're just kind of like nothing. And it's a really good lens to have. I like it. So is it Faithlessness and Fiasco?
Yeah, and Fatelessness I would recommend more. That's the highlight. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I mean, is there anything you're working on currently, or any place you'd like people to visit to read your stuff?
Well, I am going to be working on a couple articles, but I don't know when they will be done. But yeah, keep an eye out for it. Yeah, I just have to get myself together and get them done.
Yeah, well, I'll be keeping an eye out for it, and I recommend that people follow you on Twitter for the most I don't know the most well framed perspectives on our current a slow motion disaster. So I really recommend Alex's Twitter, which is at Galaxy Brain, with a brain that is not spelled like normal brain. I don't know how to spell in English because we have a phonetic what's that called? Oh, pregnancy brain, sorry, phonetic vocabulary here in Romania. So whenever I saw movies about spelling bees in America, I thought that was just absolutely crazy. Why would you need to spell stuff? But now I need to spell stuff, so I don't know how. So if you want to
Yeah.
spell your Twitter handle, please go ahead.
Spell it.
Yeah, if you want
Yeah.
to, but I think
Oh,
it's good.
it's yeah, at Galaxy Brain, GALEXYBRANE.
Perfect. Thank you for doing that. Yeah, that it might seem excessive, but it's
Yeah.
just because the last thing is it's not intuitive, so it's good.
Yeah.
It will be in the show notes as well, so
Yeah.
it's
They'll
all
get
gravy.
it.
And I also recommend that people read your article in the Bellows for what was the title of the article?
It's called The Great COVID Class War, and it's about essentially the massive wealth transfer um, and how it happened.
Yeah, yeah, that I definitely recommend that because it really strikes all the necessary chords for people to get woke on this stuff. Because if you're wavering about the effectiveness of lockdown or the second order consequences of it, yeah, read this and get back to me. To be honest. So Alex, thank you so much for
Yeah,
for
thank you so
coming
much for
on.
having me.
It's been a pleasure.